In this video I will make a double sliding fence for both the table saw and the router table. The fence will move on ball bearing drawer slides. I mark the position. I measure the distance to the edge, and then I move the mark, so that it is easier to adjust the router bit on it. I push the router until the bit touches the table. I block it, and with the depth adjustment I adjust it to the height of the slides. I put the router on the pencil mark, with the router bit towards the inside of the table, and the pencil mark towards the side of the table. I adjust the router guide against the side of the table, and I route a groove along the table. I want them to be right on the side rails of my homemade table. I use a straight router bit, with a diameter smaller than the width of the drawer slides. I move the router bit edge until it is flush with the side of the groove that it is near to the side of the table. Now I release the router guide. I put the drawer slide between the guide and the edge of the table, and I block the guide. Now I can push the guide against the table edge, and I finish routing the groove to the right width. I route another groove like that in the other side of the table. The drawer slides will go inside the grooves. I cut a couple of 12 cm wide pieces. This will be the side of the double fence. Don't use loose clothes like that when you cut with your table saw. I adjust that wooden bar, the provisional fence, to cut another piece. Now I cut that piece in 7 by 7 cm square pieces, 8 squares and 2 square triangles. I will glue each triangle to the edge of one square. I put all the pieces in place, but without glue. I measure some centimeters to each side of the hole where the router bit protrudes the table. I mark in the side and in the base. I draw a semicircle in the base and a rectangle in the side. I use a jigsaw to cut the square in the side. And I cut the semicircle in the base, too. With a rust file and sandpaper, I bevel the inside of the semicircle. That will improve the sawdust extraction. I adjust the depth of cut of my router to the width of that 3 mm MDF sheet. I use a couple of wooden pieces to help guiding the router while I route to each side of the hole. It was not a good idea to use a sheet that thin. Later I had to make some changes that I will show in another video. With a file I adjust that cut until the sheet is flush with the size. With the help of our wooden clamps, I glue all the pieces. Some pieces of newspaper will help to avoid that the fence and the clamps are glued together. Here we can see the triangles that I glued to the edge of the two squares. They go right behind the hole in the side. I will cover that with some pieces of MDF sheet to make a box to connect the vacuum cleaner hose. I need a lot of clamps to hold the squares. I have these cheap ones. If you don't have so many clamps, you can always glue and clamp some of the squares, and later glue and clamp the others. Before the glue dries, I must make sure that the sides are at a perfect square angle with the base. I measure the position of the squares, and I mark the position on each side and in the base. Once I know the place of the squares, I measure 3 cm from the edge to know where to put the screws. I drill guide holes, and I insert a couple of screws in each square, one in the base and one in the side. I measure a third of the length of the fence, and I draw two parallel lines, one 10 mm from the other, and with the ends of the lines 4 cm from the sides of the fence. With a 10 mm drill bit and a sacrificial piece of wood below the fence, I drill a hole on each side between the lines. I draw the parallel lines in the other side of the base, and I cut a groove with a jigsaw. I check that an 8 mm threaded rod goes loose into that groove. I put the fence in place, against the saw disc, but the most important thing is to adjust the fence to the sides of the table, and later I would adjust the saw to be parallel with the fence if needed. I draw the groove on the table, and in each side of the fence I mark the center of the grooves. I draw a line from the mark in one side to the mark in the other side. With that lines I know where to screw the drawer slides. I open the slides all the way, and I put them on the lines so that they protrude one side, enough to screw them to the table in the side where I have the saw. I screw the slides to the fence base. I drill a hole between the lines in the table to insert a nut. I drill it far from the saw disc, and I insert the nut from below the table board. I make sure I can screw the rod in that nut. I move the slides to the router side, and then I put the fence in place on the table board, right against the saw disc. I push to fit in the slides inside the grooves. In the router table side, I screw the slides to the table board. I slide my fence all the way to the other side, and I screw the slides in that side of the table board. I cut this plywood disc when I made the router table. I insert there a nut. I screw a piece of 8 mm threaded rod, and I block it with epoxy and a locking nut. I can block the fence in the wished place by screwing that disc into the nut inserted in the table board and tightening it. The drawer slides have a slight side-to-side movement, so they don't make the perfectly parallel movement I was wishing. I try to get a fence that moves perfectly parallel, so I put one wooden bar in each side of the table to fit the fence in the sides of the table. I had to use some nuts in my rotor lift crank to give room. Now I can move the crank when the fence is in place. The MDF board that I used to make the fence is 1 mm longer than the pieces of plywood I used in my table board, and the fence doesn't perfectly fit in the sides of the table. I sand the MDF, and I use some splinters to make it fit in the table sides. I should use the same kind of plywood board to make the fence. Now I don't have the side-to-side movement, and the fence moves perfectly parallel. I cover the box, and I draw the hole I need to fit my vacuum cleaner hose. I drill a hole, and then I cut the circle with a marquetry saw. I draw in my MDF sheet a rectangle some bigger than the route I made before in one of the sides of the fence, and I cut it, and I sand it until it fits in place. I bevel the holes so that the heads of the screws don't protrude the surface of the sheet. Here I have to sand, so that this doesn't hook the pieces of wood when I root them. I put a router bit, and I move the sliding fence to cut a hole in the vertical insert. If I use a router bit with a bearing, I have to cut first the shape of the bit with a marquetry saw. If it is difficult to slide the sliding fence, I can put some pieces of playing card between the base and the drawer slides to reduce friction. I can apply some wax in the wooden bars and in the sides of the table, too. If I sand the table board, the fence slides even better, and the work pieces will slide better, too. And there I have my double fence, to use both with my router table and my table saw. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel. I have another channel in Spanish, with more than 100 woodworking videos. You can find the link in my channel and in the description of this video. Thanks for watching.